In the beginning of this era, 4 great empires extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific, favoring cultural and economic contact between these two ends of the world. Goods, techniques, and customs, as well as ideas, myths, and religions, travel along the trading routes. From the 3rd century onwards, these great empires are threatened by internal crises and invasions. China is divided into 3 independent states, and the kingdom of the Han disappears. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire extends toward India and survives the attacks from Rome and from the northern people. In India, the Kushan Empire is substituted by the Gupta Empire, which shortly after is destroyed by the White Huns. In Rome, the external threats are added to a long period of political, economic, and religious instability, which takes Diocletian to divide the empire in 2 parts, ruled by 4 emperors. In the 4th century, Constantine undertakes big improvements in order to achieve the stability and continuity of the Roman Empire. One of them was to move the capital to an easily defended location between Europe and Asia.
The city of Constantinople was founded on top of the ancient Byzantium, a Greek colony situated in the Bosphorus Strait, a meeting point between Europe and Asia. It is a strategic place between East and West, and when Constantine installed the imperial seat here, it is due to an essential strategic need, because Rome is far away from the military operation front. This pushes the German barbarians as far as the Danube in Central Europe, and the Persians as far as the Euphrates, already in Asian territory.
The Roman Empire extends all over the Mediterranean area, but its oriental area is the most wealthy, cultured, and populated, it being the heir to the ancient cultures of Egypt, Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and the Middle East. Constantinople can dominate the commerce between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, as Troy had done in antiquity, and is closer to the goods from the east, which arrive via the Silk Road. Thanks to imperial support, administrative and commercial control converts it in a short time into the most important city of the empire. As with other empires, the 5th century Roman Empire suffers pressure on its borders, which increases while its internal disintegration grows more evident.
The barbarians did not arrive overnight, and they were not alien. They had been living on the borders of the empire for generations. From east to west and from north to south, there were people approaching. Rome needed them as well, and in a certain way they became part of its orbit, and in some cases stronger than in others, particularly in the west, where they virtually replaced the preceding power structure.
The division of the Roman Empire and the removal of its capital to New Rome ensures imperial survival 1,000 years after the so-called fall of the Roman Empire, in which it loses its western provinces. The Eastern Roman Empire incorporates Greek elements and elements of many other countries into Roman civilization. In Byzantium, we have a synthesis of all these elements with Christianity and its culture, transmitted through books, arts, and a new imperial model. Its influence goes right beyond its boundaries and continues in other countries and cultures, right up to the present day. In the 3rd century, the ancient world suffers a profound crisis. In the last epochs, cultural and social values collapse, and materialism rules.
Since the foundation of Constantinople in 330 AD, many religions cohabited within the Roman Empire, and not only the religion of the antiquity, which had also changed. But I insist there were many more, mystical, traditional, and others of Egyptian influence, as well as the Christian religion. Christianity was becoming stronger each day. This is true. It is also true that ancient religions were falling apart little by little.
In the face of this degeneration, a lot of beliefs, moral, and philosophical reactions are developed. Epicureanism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism on one hand, on the other, Eastern religions, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and Mithraism. From Egypt, Gnosticism gets incorporated, as well as the cult of Isis, with the boy Horus and Osiris, the god who dies and is resurrected. From Greece arrive Orphism and the religions of the mysteries, like the cult of Eleusis, the cult of Dionysus, a god who dies, descends to hell, and is resurrected. Then there is Delphi, the sacred mountain of pilgrimages, pillar of ancient mythology, and finally some minority salvationist groups like the Essenes and the Therapists. Among this mosaic of beliefs, Christianity extends rapidly due to its apostolic character, by transmitting new hope to the humble and disinherited, with its values of forgiveness and greater humanity. At the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine, facing the disintegration of the old world, seeks a new social cohesion that will sustain the empire. At first, in 313, he enacts the Edict of Milan, recognizing freedom of worship, and afterwards he summons the Christians to the Council of Nicaea, where Christianity and its creed, a selection of the Gospels and the writings, its theology, and also a hierarchy similar to the Roman administrative structure are made official. This new official religion of the imperial court is the synthesis of ancient worship with profound and diverse roots in the remote past, elements of which it is prepared to accept. It possesses a great capacity to adapt and absorb the myths, worship, and traditions of the places it reaches.
With the spreading of Christianity in the 4th century, and afterwards under the government of Constantine the Great, it becomes the official religion of the state. But pagan tradition did not disappear in any way from science or education. And on the other hand, those who raised the sons of Constantine the Great, the emperor who introduced Christianity, were pagan philosophers and historians.
Part of the classic culture of the gymnasiums and the cult of physical beauty, classical theater and poetry, is substituted by the new culture of the Holy Scriptures. Parallel to this, in the Egyptian desert, small groups of hermits are developing, and already in the 4th century structured communities with their own rules have taken shape. This will be the origin of the monastic orders that will develop strongly and will prosper in the West and the East. In the following centuries, they will become the pillars of society. On the other hand, when Christianity is adopted by the upper classes, who are educated in classical knowledge, it is necessary to strengthen Christian theology and philosophy. This task is undertaken by the Fathers of the Church, who make use of the arguments of Hellenic philosophy and Alexandrian Neoplatonism.
Византийская культура, в целом, если ее характеризовать, культура, прежде всего, книжная.
Byzantine culture was a book culture.
На традиции,
oriented towards knowledge based on the book, summarizing pagan Hellenic traditions and Christian wisdom, concentrated around the book. That was the ground of all research and all knowledge.
Despite the existence of an important oral culture, Byzantium will settle on the written culture. Classical Greek knowledge facilitates the study and preservation of the texts from antiquity.
Byzantium has always been seen as the transmitter of classical culture and has been so, confined to an elite. That elite has contributed in an important way, right up to the modern era, to the transmission of ancient texts. The great classics of antiquity, from Homer to Demosthenes, from Hesiod to Lysias, and many authors of antiquity.
Christianity adopts classical antiquity and transforms it. In literature, ancient heroes such as Achilles, Odysseus, and Hector have new virtues, more in accordance with the new values, and they coexist with saints and martyrs. A new literary genre appears, the hagiography, in which the saint will be the literary character par excellence, the role model to be imitated. Education is based on the study of classical texts, but gradually they are substituted by the Holy Scriptures. By the middle of the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian decided to close the Academy of Athens, the last center where classical philosophical studies were cultivated, considering them pagan. After the so-called Dark Ages of several centuries, in the 9th century, a political, economic, and cultural recovery takes place. The empire extends its boundaries, and Christianity reaches the Slavic countries. Study of the works of the Fathers of the Church leads to the rediscovery of secular Greek literature. The Magna Aura School is recognized in the Imperial Palace, teaching philosophy, grammar, and rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. The encyclopedia serves as the library of the Patriarch Photius, and the Suda Encyclopedia becomes fashionable. Philosophy, history, science, and literature are copied again, now in large quantities due to the use of small letters. And Byzantium is proud of being the heir to ancient Greek culture, as is also the Arab world. Two centuries later, Constantinus IX sets up the Imperial School of Law and the School of Philosophy, run by Psellus, perhaps the most learned Byzantine of all times. With the plundering of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204, numerous manuscripts are destroyed, but the decline of Byzantium is only political and military. After recapturing Constantinople, Michael VIII, initiator of the Paleologan dynasty, restored the higher teaching of philosophy and the Patriarchal Academy. This is the beginning of a splendid era, possibly the antecedent of the Italian Renaissance. One of the most interesting and original intellectual centers of the final years was, beyond doubt, Mistras. From 1300, Byzantium seemed to recover all its drive. Between the 13th and the 15th centuries, scholars such as Maximus Planudes, Theodorus Metochates, Barlaam of Calabria, and Georgius Gemistus Plethon appear, whose broad knowledge turned them into real Renaissance men.
Архитектура, мозаики, фресковая декорация.
The architecture, the mosaics, the frescoes, the icons, the art of small forms, and a great deal of other artistic output made up an amazing world. which occupied an important place in the Byzantine civilization as a whole, particularly with regard to knowledge and education.
Совершенно важнейшее место занимала именно в византийской цивилизации в целом, и в том числе в просвещении, в познании.
Byzantine art has its root in the Greco-Roman world. Thus, in the first epochs, the ancient mythological themes are represented with the new Christian values, and ancient traditions in the plastic arts are preserved. Built in the 6th century during the reign of Justinian, St. Sophia is the largest Christian church for 1,000 years, until the construction of St. Peter of Rome. This cathedral serves as a model for Byzantine churches due to its aesthetic and symbolic value.
Для современников, конечно, это было просто как одно из чудес света.
It can be considered one of the great wonders of mankind.
В Москве, вот знаменитый источник, это в русских летописях рассказывается о том, как
When the ambassador of the Prince of Kiev, Vladimir the Saint, arrives at St. Sophia's Church in Constantinople at the end of the 10th century, he is so amazed that he becomes entranced, not knowing if they were in heaven or on earth.
The production of icons in wall paintings or wood was abundant. They were reproductions of biblical stories and of the life of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Initially, the figures were represented as hieratic, reminiscent of Egyptian art.
Uno dei grandi pensatori
One of the great theologians and thinkers of Byzantium, John Damascene, refers to painting as a book for the illiterate.
come libro degli analfabeti.
Thus the illiterates, who are not able to read or interpret the Christian doctrine through the writings, could do so through painting and figurative drawing of the sacred scene. Thus painting was seen as a great book for the illiterate.
Quindi la pittura veniva vista come un grande libro per gli analfabeti.
Between the 8th and 9th centuries, by decree of the so-called iconoclast emperors, religious representations and icons are banned and removed from churches.
A religious tradition that was opposed to using images that goes back as far as the Old Testament. A tradition characteristic of the Middle East. This is what we see in the Islamic world, in the Byzantine world, and in previous periods.
Bizans dünyasında görüyoruz. Daha önce görüyoruz.
In the following centuries, the emperors and the church embark on important works of patronage. Numerous churches and monasteries were built, and handicraft production borders on fastidiousness. Byzantine art is an anonymous art, in which the artists, conserving ancient techniques, imbued their materials with great theological value. Gold, silver, mosaics, enamel, polished marble, and precious stones that shone represented the divine light. The strong Eastern Roman administration was a model that was transmitted with adaptations to the Russian Slavic world, Western Europe, and the Arabic administration of the Caliph. The empire's ability to build is crucial for its survival. For 1,000 years, its immense walls survived attacks by numerous peoples, right up to the appearance of gunpowder and cannons. Other marvelous examples of this ability were the aqueducts and cisterns, that provided water to populations sometimes exceeding 500,000 inhabitants. The people who failed at the walls were trying to conquer the myth and the dream that is Constantinople, the city of gold. This image as a myth and a source of abundance comes from its palaces, imperial ceremonial, the ornamentation, the mosaics, the silk, the silver, and the economic resources that come from controlling trade. This myth had its symbols.
On the present flag of Russia, we can see the two-headed eagle, which is the symbol of Byzantium. The Russians have adopted it as they believe that they are, and to a certain degree they are, heirs of Byzantium, and that the Russian Empire is a Byzantine heritage, and not only Russia. Other countries have also, as their symbol, two-headed eagle, because they have roots in the Byzantine Empire.
Another example given was Constantine's adoption of the Persian tiara as a symbol of imperial power. With this act, he settled on a style that evolves into the real crowns that all monarchies flaunted.
At the time in Toledo, everything was called the imitati imperii, that is, to completely imitate everything that was happening in Constantinople. And, in fact, Toledo at the end of the 6th century and beginning of the 7th century was a copy of the imperial court that Constantine established in the city. It is the imperial ideal maintained in the East, the main idea and the main reference that is used in Toledo and in Hispania. Obviously, a common world exists, a common culture exists around the Mediterranean, and it is obvious that it is the empire that makes the models, the fashion to be followed.
But perhaps the most important contribution in this field was Roman law, which was preserved and distributed thanks to the compilations of the emperors Theodosius and Justinian. These compilations are the real cornerstone of law in European and American nations.
The codification movement of the 19th century very much takes into consideration what Roman law had established when the different codes of civil law in Europe were written, like the French of Napoleon, the German, the Spanish, and even outside Europe, as curiously the Japanese Code of 1898, recently modified by law in 2004.
Byzantium's influence can be traced up to the present day. The Byzantine culture and the Byzantine model were disseminated through various channels. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires are exhausted after waging a lengthy war. Commercial roads leading away from the conflict zone are strengthened, as is the Arabic zone with its center in Mecca. Under these circumstances, the Arabs and their new religion, Islam, expands rapidly from the east toward India and from the west toward Spain. Islam develops within the Byzantine Empire, in territories populated with Christian communities, which include craftsmen, administrators, scribes, and all types of Byzantine specialists.
When something like that happens,
When something like this happens, it is clear that no new conquest can create a state from scratch. It has to base itself on the social administrative structures that already exist.
At the beginning, prayer was oriented toward Jerusalem because Mohammed was considered the last of the Jewish prophets. The rule of not representing the human form deters making icons. In Islam, written and oral dissemination predominate. There is a turn toward classical Hellenic knowledge, just as will occur centuries later during the European Renaissance, but with some differences. The Arabs are not interested in literature or theater, but rather in philosophy and science. Caliphs such as Al-Mamun addressed the Emperor of Byzantium to obtain valuable manuscripts of the ancient wise men. The monumental task of translating these manuscripts to Syrian and Arabic falls upon the Greeks of Asia Minor.
The Nestorian Christians from Syria and from other zones are initially subjects of the Byzantine world, and they are the ones who translate all the works of the ancient world, all the ancient knowledge, and all that will be found in the Arabic world when it formalizes around Damascus, around the great caliphates we know. All this, too, is the origin of the translator schools in Toledo.
Greek enriches the Arabic language, while Plato, Aristotle, and other Hellenic authors inspire diverse currents of thought and spirituality.
The Arabs or the Muslims do not receive.
The Arabs or the Muslims did not receive the classical Greek heritage in a void, in a time capsule. What they received is what the Byzantine gave them, and part of what they received is the Byzantine interpretation of what those texts meant. And of course, they adapted it to their own needs and meanings.
Elements of Persian and Indian culture are added to this syncretism. A universal culture integrating Greek science and philosophy into a Muslim conception of the world is created. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks take over Constantinople and replace the Byzantine administrative control, occupying almost the same territories, at the same time renewing the confrontation between what had been the western and eastern parts of the Roman Empire. Constantinople becomes the multi-ethnic center of a new civilization, which gathers together Turkish Mongolian, Islamic, and Byzantine traditions.
To be an heir of the Roman Empire meant that, with the conquest of Istanbul, the Ottomans really became an empire, a great empire directed from its center, Istanbul. And just like the Byzantine Empire, maintained a multicultural, multinational, multilingual, and multi-confessional imperial structure.
Bizancio ocupa una función absolutamente esencial.
Byzantium has an absolutely essential function, the very intelligent politics started by the Byzantine emperors and by the Church, to attract their new countries, which are appearing on the borders of the Danube, or people coming from the steppe. This gives birth to a missionary diplomacy that will from the start be in charge of the evangelizing of the Slavs in Central Europe, in what nowadays are the Czech countries, Bohemia and Moravia. They were evangelized by the brothers Cyril and Metodio, who were Greek-speaking, but also Slavic-speaking, therefore Byzantine, probably Christianized Slavs. And naturally, they were Hellenized as their language of the liturgy was Greek. We'll try to bring these new countries in Europe into orbit around Byzantium, and to carry out the evangelization of these countries, and they also provide them with writing. Thus the Cyrillic alphabet is created, not the present one, but the Glagolitic one. The present Cyrillic alphabet came later, but adopted the name of Cyril.
Nace así el alfabeto cirílico. No el actual, sino el antiguo, el glagolítico. El alfabeto cirílico actual es un poco posterior, pero bueno, toma el nombre de Cirilo.
The Slavic zone that is in contact with the Byzantine Empire becomes an area of influence, modeling itself to the style of the empire. The influx to the Slavic north increases progressively and expands toward Russia. Byzantium sends architects and craftsmen who participate in the construction of monuments, such as Saint Sophia of Kiev, and the churches of the Annunciation and Saint Basil in Moscow.
And exactly in the same way, in the Orthodox Slavic countries, Bulgaria, Serbia, Moravia, Russia, the post-Byzantine tradition was very well preserved until the 18th century, and even in other places until the 19th century. In this way, the ecclesiastic tradition granted this extraordinary capacity of conserving this artistic culture.
In Moscow, which will be named the Third Rome, the Tsar is crowned in accordance with the imperial model and symbolism. Speaking about spirituality, from the center of spirituality that Mount Athos represents, a new mystical phenomenon expands, hesychism, a word that derives from hesychia, or quietude. This deepening into the religious experience drives the renewal of the Orthodox Church. Hesychism has an extraordinary acceptance in Russia and influenced personalities such as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. From the beginning, there was a strong bond between Byzantium and what is present-day Italy. The creation of the Carolingian Empire marks a breaking point between the Orthodox and Catholic Church, which will become the Western Schism in 1054. The era of the Crusades begins. In the year 1204, the Fourth Crusade, with the help of the Venetian fleet, invades Constantinople, stripping it of its treasures and destroying a great many very valuable books that will be lost forever. However, from the 13th century on, cultural and commercial relationships progressively intensify. In 1439, the Council of Florence tried to mediate between Roman Christians and Orthodox Christians. On this occasion, a Byzantine delegation travels to the city, composed in part of dignitaries of the Mistress Circle, such as Georgius Gemistus Plethon, who carried with him many texts of ancient Greek wisdom. After the takeover of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453, many other Byzantines follow this route.
Можете представить, Италия, Флоренция эпохи Quattrocento, средоточие.
As we can imagine, in Florence of 1400, the best of the European culture was concentrated.
Когда византийское государство,
And therefore, when the Byzantine state as a political system collapsed as a result of the Ottoman invasion, many humanists, men of education, immigrated to the universities of Italy, in Pisa, Bologna, and Florence, and occupied the main seats in the scientific and educational
заняли
centers in Italy.
ведущие кафедры в итальянских учебных и научных центрах.
Translations of the Greek text multiply. Based on the teachings of Gemistus Plethon, Cosimo de' Medici the Elder founds the Platonic Academy in Florence, which will translate Plato's texts, in addition to other texts of Alexandrian origin that dealt with the Hermetic alchemist tradition. When a new conception of the world opens up to the Renaissance man, he refers back to classical antiquity. Interest in the beauty of the human body, naturalism, and the technical perfection of the classics are valid once again. Greek myths also return and settle in the European soul, being interpreted as allegories of profound truths. The ancient knowledge that the Byzantines preserved for 1100 years fuels the appearance of the humanists of the 15th century. No aspect of science, spirituality, or European art will be able to escape this profound influence. Byzantium is the continuation of the Roman Empire, the heir to Hellenism and to the ancient cultures of the Mediterranean, and as such it is a synthesis of the ancient world shaped by Christian religion. Constantine applies Roman organizational mentality to the new religion in an attempt to perpetuate the empire. Byzantium preserves classical culture in an era of social and cultural instability.
I have to tell you that everything that has been rescued from the ancient Hellenic tradition, all the tradition, the writers, the tragedies and the comedies, the historians, the orators, etc., all this has been saved through Byzantium.
It also creates an administrative, architectural, artistic, and religious model that will be imitated by the West, by Russo-Slavic Europe, and by the area of Islam, each adapting it to its own form. Byzantium is a common root, a meeting place for civilizations.
Perhaps the study and better knowledge of Byzantium and its significance as a great civilizing matrix at these moments of European integration are more essential than ever, because, except in a very few specific fields in the Western science, the great unknown has always been Byzantium.
Artık yavaş yavaş değiştiklerini görmeye başlıyoruz ve
in scientific environments, we can see that there is a tendency emerging to perceive the present Turkey as a heir.
Kültürel olarak bugünkü Türkiye'yi
geographically or culturally, of the Byzantine Empire of the East as part of its cultural heritage.
Kültürel mirasımızın bir parçası olarak gelme eğiliminin geliştiğini görüyoruz.
The history of the Byzantine Empire, interspersing moments of glory and decay, helps us to comprehend and improve present history, overcoming the nationalism and prejudice that have mystified it for 5 centuries, both in the East and in the West. If we know about the past and understand the contribution to our common history made by other cultures, we may, in the future, be able to help build the universal human nation.